What if the next global economic shock does not begin in a bank, a stock exchange, or a factory, but in a narrow strip of water between Iran and Oman? That is why the Strait of Hormuz matters. For years, the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran played out through proxy wars, missile programs, regional influence, and ideological competition. But now that rivalry has moved into something even bigger, it has entered the global energy system itself. And when that happens, this stops being only a Middle East story. It becomes a story about oil prices, inflation, supply chains, shipping routes, and the cost of living almost everywhere else. Because the Strait of Hormuz is not just another sea lane, it is one of the most important energy choke points on Earth. Around 20 million barrels of oil move through it each day, alongside major LNG flows, and most of that energy heads toward Asia. Hormuz is one of the world's most critical oil choke points. So, this is the real question. What happens when one side has the oil and the other side can threaten the route? That is the real Saudi Iran oil war. When people hear the phrase oil war, they usually think of a price war. They imagine one producer flooding the market, crashing prices, and trying to squeeze out competitors. But that is not what this is. This is not mainly a war over cheap barrels. It is an energy war over routes, disruption, leverage, and confidence. Saudi Arabia's strength is obvious. It has massive production capacity, financial resilience, and limited ability to reroute some exports through the East West pipeline to the Red Sea. Iran's strength is different. Iran cannot outproduce Saudi Arabia, but it sits beside the narrow maritime artery that Gulf energy still depends on. Saudi Arabia has increased westbound export rerouting through its east-west pipeline, while other Gulf bypass options remain limited relative to normal Hormuz flows. That difference is the heart of the story. Saudi Arabia can pump, Iran can choke, and in energy politics, the power to disrupt can matter just as much as the power to produce. That is what makes this confrontation so dangerous, because once markets start believing a route is unreliable, the damage spreads far beyond the battlefield. And that leads to the next question. How exactly did this rivalry move from regional tension into a global energy emergency? The immediate trigger was the wider war involving Iran, the United States, and Israel. But the Saudi Iran dimension comes from what happened after the fighting escalated. Shipping through Hormuz became heavily disrupted. Gulf producers began cutting output, drawing on storage, rerouting cargoes, and searching for ways to keep exports moving. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Kuwait were all forced to reduce production in part because tanker movement through the strait had been constrained, while Saudi exports through Red Sea routes increased as Riyadh redirected flows westward. This is where Saudi Arabia becomes central. Riyadh is not just another oil producer caught in the crossfire. It is the Gulf state most associated with reliability in global oil markets. Saudi Arabia wants to show that even during war, its oil can still reach customers. Iran wants to prove the opposite. It wants to show that no Gulf energy order can function normally if Tehran is under sustained military pressure. That is why Hormuz matters so much. It is not just a shipping lane, it is a test of credibility. Saudi Arabia is trying to preserve confidence, Iran is trying to destroy it. And if confidence in Gulf energy security breaks, then the consequences do not stop with tankers and pipelines. They hit the global economy. The danger here is not just war, it is concentration. Too much of the world's energy still depends on too few routes. The IEA says roughly 20 million barrels per day pass through Hormuz, and more than 80% of those oil flows go to Asian markets. That means the countries most exposed to a prolonged disruption are the major Asian importers first and foremost. China faces a supply and price problem. India faces a severe import bill and inflation problem. Japan and South Korea face a direct energy security problem. Europe faces yet another external shock at a moment when resilience is already thin. And the United States is in a mixed position. America is less directly dependent on Gulf imports than it used to be, but it is not protected from global oil pricing. When global crude rises sharply, American consumers still feel it. Even countries with lower direct import dependence remain exposed to market-wide price shocks from a major Hormuz disruption. That is why oil shocks never stay inside the oil market. They spill into transport, into manufacturing, into food prices, and into fertilizer, into electricity and logistics. So the consequences of this crisis extend beyond crude oil to broader economic vulnerabilities, including food and fertilizer pressures. Hence, the stakes are larger than fuel. This is about whether a regional war can force the rest of the world to absorb another major economic shock. And that brings us to Saudi Arabia's real dilemma. Saudi Arabia is stronger than many of its customers, but it is not comfortable and it is not invulnerable. This is the part many people miss. Yes, higher oil prices can boost Saudi revenues in the short term. Yes, Riyadh has more flexibility than many import dependent economies. Yes, it has more room to absorb volatility than most states in the region. But prolonged instability is still dangerous for Saudi Arabia because Saudi Arabia does not just need high prices, it needs a functioning market. It needs customers to believe the Gulf supply is dependable. It needs the world to keep seeing Saudi energy as stable, scalable, and politically manageable. That puts Riyadh in a double position. It can benefit from tighter markets in the short run, but it loses if the crisis becomes so severe that it damages long term trust in Gulf energy reliability. That is why the Saudi strategy during an energy crisis can look contradictory. It may support stabilizing markets, it may increase rerouting, it may quietly coordinate around emergency responses, but it also wants to avoid being dragged into an open ended regional war. It is true that Saudi Red Sea export traffic has risen sharply as Hormuz traffic has fallen, yet the broader Gulf energy system remains under intense pressure. So, this is not a simple story of Saudi advantage, it is a story of Saudi survival inside a fragile energy order. And now the big question becomes, can this crisis still be contained? There are really two paths from here. The first is a contained crisis. In that scenario, emergency stock releases, naval protection, quiet diplomacy, rerouting through bypass pipelines, and market coordination prevent a complete breakdown. Reuters reported that the IEA moved toward what was described as the largest ever emergency oil release from strategic reserves as markets reeled from the crisis. That would not solve the deeper strategic problem, but it could stop the worst case economic shock. The second path is much more dangerous, a prolonged confrontation. If attacks continue, shipping insurance stays prohibitively high, export bottlenecks remain in place, and the market loses confidence in Gulf reliability, then the crisis stops being a temporary spike. It becomes a structural energy shock, and that is where the numbers start to matter in a much more frightening way. If roughly 20 million barrels per day are disrupted and only a limited share can be bypassed, the lost volumes cannot be replaced quickly. That is the kind of shock that turns a regional war into a global economic event. And once that happens, the consequences spread quickly. Higher inflation, more political pressure on governments, more strain on central banks, more shipping disruption, more pressure on import dependent economies. In other words, the real danger is not only the disruption itself, it is the loss of confidence that follows. So, the real Saudi Iran oil war is not mainly about who can sell more crude. It is about who can shape the system around that crude. Saudi Arabia represents supply, spare capacity, rerouting, and the effort to keep the market alive. Iran represents disruption, choke point pressure, and the ability to make the entire system feel fragile. One side is trying to prove that the Gulf can still deliver energy under fire. The other is trying to prove that it cannot. And as long as the Strait of Hormuz remains the narrow bridge between Gulf energy and the wider world, that struggle will matter far beyond the Middle East. Because in energy politics, power is not just about owning the oil. It is about controlling the route, shaping the risk, and forcing everyone else to respond. If you found this breakdown useful, subscribe for more geopolitical analysis. And in the comments, tell me this. If the Hormuz crisis continues, who really holds the stronger hand? Saudi Arabia with production or Iran with disruption?